Hello, everyone. And those of you who are not yet settled, let's just all settle here to hear our last panel of the day, the closing panel, Global Impact, and this will be moderated by Jim Hendler.
So, as was mentioned, I am not Deborah Estrin. I hope most of you have figured that out already. Unfortunately, at the last minute, she couldn't make it. And then this was originally going to be 2 mini panels, one with 3 speakers on health and one with 3 people on the other. We have lost 1 or 2 of our speakers, or 3, including the moderator. So, you know, I'm Jim Hendler. It actually works okay for me to moderate this because I'm actually chair of the ACM's Technology Policy Council, which actually has a lot of discussion of exactly these kind of issues of how what we do in ACM impacts the world and what we can do to help policymakers understand that. We're going to still run it sort of as 2 mini panels. So let me start by reading Deborah's 1-minute introduction. She said, in the earlier panels, we heard from top scholars and practitioners about many challenges faced by computer science as an intellectual discipline. The committee designed this last panel of the day to provide inspiring examples of where computer scientists are having impact by looking outside of our field, addressing societally critical issues through computation and emerging technologies. Now, even though it was originally, originally it was going to be 1 section that was was completely on health and 1 on some other things, we're still going to run it that way. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker. So I'm very happy to introduce Priya Donti, who's a grad student at CMU, and she's the co-founder and chair of Climate Change AI. Among many awards and honors we can mention is she was one of the MIT Technologies 35 under 35, I guess last year. So with that, let me just let you go, Priya.
All right. Thanks so much to the ACM organizers for organizing today. So today I want to talk about climate change. So climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we as a society are facing today, and we're already seeing its effects from storms to droughts to fires to flooding. According to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, these impacts are being felt globally. They are disproportionately being felt by the world's most disadvantaged populations, and they interact deeply with many other global challenges that we're facing today, such as food security, biodiversity loss, and so forth, and health, I should actually say as well. I think the slides are auto-advancing, so if we could actually go back still. Okay, great. So when we talk about addressing climate change, there are 2 aspects to this. So one of these is climate change mitigation, which refers to either reducing the amount of greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere or preventing the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And according to the IPCC, in order to stave off some of the worst impacts of climate change, we as a society will need to hit net 0 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And in practice, that means that over the next decade, we need to make many crucial technology and policy advances in order to hit that 2050 target. Given that we've already locked in some amount of climate change, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will continue to stay there for decades to centuries to come. We also need to think very deeply about climate change adaptation. How do we build resilience to those consequences of climate change that are going to occur? And this requires building, again, resilience and resilient societies at a local scale globally, so locally at a global scale. So given that we're here talking about computing, right? So how can, given this, this huge imperative to act quickly on climate change, how do AI and computing, for example, play a role in this? So about 3 years ago, a group of co-authors and I wrote a paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning that actually enumerates how AI can be used to address these challenges, ranging across areas such as energy, agriculture, and finance. So there's some pictures here on the slides, but in that paper we talk about how, for example, AI and machine learning technologies can be used to distill raw sources of information like satellite imagery in order to give us information on, for example, where buildings are, in order to then inform building energy efficiency planning strategies. Or we can use sensor data to understand where methane leaks are occurring in order to reduce those. Or take large corpora of policy documents and analyze those using natural language processing technologies in order to then inform decision, in order to inform decision making by policymakers. AI and machine learning technologies can also be used to provide forecasts and foresight in situations like when we're trying to balance electrical power grids with large amounts of renewable energy. Can we understand how much solar power we're likely to have at a given moment? Or can we predict when extreme events are going to happen at a city scale so that city-level policymakers can actually respond to that? AI and machine learning technologies can also help us to optimize complex systems like electric power grids, but even things like supply chain and freight transportation systems. And they can also, as we've heard about on previous panels, actually help to accelerate the scientific discovery of next generation clean technologies, things like next generation batteries and CO2 sorbents, basically sponges, like sponges for sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, these both represent opportunities that, for things that can be implemented today, and they also represent opportunities for innovative research in AI and machine learning. Things like physics-informed machine learning. How do we actually use machine learning to speed up climate simulations in a way that employs the data that we have in these situations and also employs the actual science that we know as to how the climate evolves? Robust and safe machine learning also come into play. For instance, when we're trying to optimize an electric power grid, how do we actually do this in a way that doesn't break the power grid and enables us to integrate renewable energy? And the way this theme plays out in a place like an electric power grid where there are certain notions of robustness may play out differently than if we have notions of robustness that come up in, for example, computer vision. So the specific climate change related challenges can actually drive different directions of innovation in the machine learning methods themselves. So similarly, interpretability, uncertainty quantification, transfer learning, all of these things come up in climate change related workflows in slightly nuanced and different ways than they might otherwise if you were using these in other contexts. And so there's a lot of kind of interesting research to be done here. So while we can talk about how AI can help us address climate change, it's also worth noting that AI has a really multifaceted and nuanced relationship with climate change as a whole. For example, AI is a general purpose technology, which it means it, of course, can be used for many different societal applications, including accelerating applications in emissions intensive sectors. For instance, AI has made billions of dollars of profits for the oil and gas industry. So there's a good report out about this called Oil in the Cloud by Greenpeace, which talks about how advanced analytics and AI have basically helped accelerate oil and gas extraction and exploration in a way that's increased the competitive advantage of these kinds of technologies. There are also many applications of AI where the applications themselves have very wide implications for climate change, even though we don't always necessarily think of these these applications as climate relevant. So for example, as we think about developing autonomous vehicles, right, a very fundamentally AI-enabled technology, depending on how we develop autonomous vehicles, this might happen in a way that entrenches the roles of private and fossil-fueled transportation, or it could happen in a way that really enables multimodal and low emissions and public transportation. And we have a lot of choice points that we can make when actually figuring out how to take that particular technology forward. In an earlier panel today, we heard about the impacts of AI in social media. And of course, this has huge implications for information and misinformation on climate change in ways that impact our ability to act on this as a society. And AI-driven advertising can change consumption patterns across society in a way that, again, has implications for climate change. So it's really important to think about how these systemic impacts of AI, even in places where we're not already thinking about climate change, really do have very large implications for climate change. And then in addition, AI itself has an emissions footprint through both the computations that it does and also through the hardware that it runs on. And these aspects actually interact with each other quite a bit as well. So for example, thinking about the emissions of AI computation and hardware, this comes with increased energy and compute costs. And as pointed out, for example, in the Bender-Gebru et al. Stochastic parrots paper, this also has equity implications in terms of who actually gets to drive the development of these kinds of technologies. As for using AI, for example, for applications in climate change mitigation and adaptation, then how does this affect basically who gets to come to the table in actually developing climate change related strategies? I hope what's clear from this is that when we think about AI to address global challenges, or AI for good, it's not just about taking a couple of social good related applications, applying AI for them, and then saying that we're done. It's really about making sure that instead of, it's not about kind of then continuing the rest of AI and computing research business as usual without thinking about these challenges. It's really about how can we actually shape the way that we actually conduct AI and computing research and deployment from the ground up by design in a way that actually services these grand challenges overall. And as was talked about on an earlier panel, this is of course difficult. As we're in a world where we have to publish very quickly, or there's incentives for hockey stick growth in industries. The incentives to actually do this, to think about climate change by design, are not always there. And so there's a real imperative for us within the ACM community to really set standards and incentives within our organizations and in public policy to actually have climate change be a real, true design factor in the way we address computing.
Thank you very much. And for those who don't know, the Technology Policy Council releases tech briefs, and our first tech brief is actually on climate and computing. So you should all go to the ACM page and find that. Our next speaker, so again, a reminder, should you have questions for our first two speakers, please put them on the cards and someone will bring them to me. Otherwise, I'll just ask the questions I have. Our next speaker is Anjana Rajan, who is a cryptographer who works at the nexus of human rights and national security. She's currently the CTO of Polaris, an NGO which is fighting human trafficking. With that.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. And good. They reset the timer for you.
When I tell people that I work on human trafficking, they always assume that it's a problem that happens over there, right? They think of young children in Southeast Asia being sold for sex in a brothel. They think about migrant workers in Qatar being exploited for labor as they build soccer stadiums for the World Cup. They think of refugees in Ukraine who are being preyed on by human traffickers as they escape Russia's brutal invasion. Now, all of this is true, but what is also true is that human trafficking happens in our country too. And this is because fundamentally, human trafficking is about the powerful exploiting the vulnerable for profit. Human trafficking does not happen in a vacuum. It is a very predictable end result of every social, political, and economic system breaking. As computer scientists, we understand complex systems very well. And so it's very intuitive to us that if we want to prevent human trafficking from happening, we need to take an intersectional approach. So this means that fighting for racial and gender equality is fighting human trafficking. This means that building affordable housing is fighting human trafficking. It means fixing the foster care system is fighting human trafficking. It means ending mass incarceration and fixing our broken immigration policies and combating climate change and preventing the next global pandemic is fighting human trafficking. My name is Anjana Rajan. I am very proud to be the Chief Technology Officer of Polaris. And Polaris is a nonpartisan NGO that is leading the fight to end sex and labor trafficking and restore freedom to survivors. And we do this by responding directly to victims and survivors in need, and also working to fix the broken systems that make them vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. And we do this in three main ways. We're survivor-centered, we're justice and equity focused, and we're technology enabled. The reason we're technology enabled is because human trafficking is a massive problem. It is a $150 billion criminal industry with 25 million victims worldwide. So if you're going to work on a problem of this scale, technology has to be part of the solution. But with a problem like human trafficking, we need to think differently and build differently. And so at Polaris, we've created a new philosophy and methodology that we call mission engineering. Mission engineers at Polaris embody 4 main qualities. First, they must excel in deep tech. Second, they must take an interdisciplinary approach. Third, they must be trauma-informed. And finally, they must respond to a rapidly changing threat landscape. The way I like to describe mission engineering is if you took the speed and innovation of the private sector, the complexity and nuance of the policy sector, the compassion of the humanitarian sector, and the fearlessness of the security sector, and you put that all together, then you've got yourself a mission engineer. At Polaris, our mission engineering strategy focuses on 4 key areas of technical excellence. The first area is product engineering. For the last 15 years, we have been operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which responds to crises 24/7 and acts as a nerve center of the anti-trafficking movement. The trafficking hotline is perhaps the most scaled product I've ever worked on in my career, and as a result, it has generated the single largest data set on human trafficking in North America and the 2nd largest in the world. The second area we try to excel in is AI. If we want to reduce human trafficking, then we need to go after the traffickers where it hurts the most, and that's their profits. We launched the Polaris Financial Intelligence Unit, which combines anti-money laundering techniques with natural language processing so that we can mine our own data and find the human trafficking needle in the haystack. We then augment this with open source intelligence and shared this analysis with the global financial sector so they can stop the flow of dirty money, hold perpetrators accountable, and empower survivors to seek justice. The third area we excel in is security. Human trafficking victims have always faced a wide range of very dangerous threats, which means by proxy, so does Polaris. But over the last 2 years, our threat model has become much more complex. A global pandemic has distributed our workforce, making it easier for state-sponsored hackers to attack critical infrastructure. A disinformation crisis has caused a spike in human trafficking conspiracy theories, which motivated thousands of insurrectionists to storm our Capitol on January 6th and radicalized a white supremacist terrorist to murder 10 black people at a grocery store in Buffalo just last month. So we are working on both technical and policy solutions to protect the safety of our organization, to protect the integrity of our message, and to protect our national security and our democracy. And finally, our last area of expertise is cryptography. As technologies become more embedded in our economy, they naturally become a weapon for human traffickers to exploit their victims. So we want to help shape emerging technologies to make sure that they don't get weaponized in the first place. As a cryptographer, one of the areas we're working on right now is understanding the future of crypto and Web3. And in a few weeks, we'll be launching a new report that paints a very bold vision for how to architect Web3 in a way that protects human rights. I'll end with this one final thought. Today, we are celebrating 75 years of impact in computing. As computer scientists, we are the architects of the future. The engineers of today are building new worlds that are going to take us to Mars and the metaverse. But as humans, we are imperfect. And so our technical creations reflect back our imperfect humanity. So I believe that we have an urgent moral imperative to fix the burning problems in our communities and our countries and our planet, because if we do not, those catastrophes will follow us to the next frontier. Mission engineering can go way beyond the walls of Polaris. It is meant to be a rallying cry for this moment, because we need the smartest and bravest computer scientists to run towards the fire. And I welcome all of you to come run with us.
Thank you. And so our first audience question, I put audience in quotes because it actually came from Deborah, is for you, Anjana. And she said, you know, she's really captivated by this framing of mission engineering. What do you see that, or what would you look for from sort of the computer science people joining your efforts, what would you like to see ACM and the more general computing community doing in terms of education, research, or other things to really look at these kind of mission-focused ideas?
Yeah, I think mission engineering is meant to be a really loose framework that can be applied to a wide range of problems and a wide range of sectors, including academia. I will just, I'm sorry Deborah's not here today. I'll shut her out. That I think she in particular is leading a really important movement at Cornell Tech. I've had the pleasure of getting to watch this firsthand as a visiting practitioner there this year, as she and her colleagues are building this public interest technology movement. And I think it's important as academics to recognize that you're shaping the next generation of engineers and exposing them to the problems that we're facing is a really powerful opportunity. I will also say that nobody in this room is new to the idea of applying computer science to global problems. In fact, we heard about many of your work today. I think what is new is watching these different problems collide into this, metastasizing into this monster mega crisis. We're going to be hearing about healthcare in a moment, but I think a great example is the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only have we seen how computer science has accelerated the way we do drug discovery and how we use software to deploy vaccines, but I want to tell you also about how COVID-19 has impacted human trafficking, right? So when in March of 2020, when COVID hit the United States, borders shut down, businesses shut down, and people were not able to travel in and out of the country except for one group of people. And these were migrant workers who held an H-2A visa. These were agricultural workers because we relied on them to sustain our food supply chain. And we deemed them essential workers. And in spite of this, we saw a 70% increase in calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline reporting labor trafficking, which included abuse, wages being stolen, healthcare being denied in a pandemic. And so I think what's important to realize is, yes, we need to be using computer science to drive scientific innovation for all these problems that we're talking about today, but we also need computer science to drive humanitarian innovation. And I think that's one thing that academia can start thinking about is, what is the second and third order compounding effects of the problems we're facing today? Because this decade is our last inning, to be very blunt. And so I think we really need to start understanding what happens after the temperature rises on the planet, after the vaccine is created. And that's, I think, where we can do a better job.
So that actually leads to an audience question I have for you, Priya, which is, what about climate change remediation? So, where is computing on things like carbon sequestration, sky darkening, things like that?
Sure. So, AI, machine learning, computer science are definitely being used for these technologies. So, for example, on this axis of scientific discovery I was mentioning before, AI has been used to sort of accelerate the process of discovering more efficient carbon dioxide sorbents, which are again sort of the quote-unquote sponges that kind of separate carbon dioxide from air or from emission streams. So trying to engineer more efficient versions of these in order to kind of increase the viability of, decrease the costs of carbon removal technologies. Now, for sky darkening, geoengineering, things like that, the applications are much more speculative, given in some sense the current state of understanding the state of the art in that area. But yes, these are sort of ways that AI and machine learning are indeed being employed.
Okay, and then I have one question that's really to the two of you. I'll let you take turns or figure out how do you want to do it. And I didn't write this question. It came from the audience for real. Technology can help us to identify the problems, but how do we go from that kind of identification to action when there's really no political will in many of these cases to solve these problems?
Okay, so I have a couple of different answers to this. So one of them is that there are a lot of, ground up things that can be done today that do not necessarily, that even with today's public policy landscape, we can do. So for example, you'll see a lot of startups that are coming up in the space of can we make buildings more energy efficient using data and machine learning technologies, because it turns out that this is something that both makes sense from a climate change related perspective and makes sense under current business models. Similarly, a lot of the private investment space can play a big role here. There have been, there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about how venture capital distorts markets. So why not use it to distort markets in a way that make climate change related solutions viable and able to be invested in at a wider scale. I also would say that the policy landscape is not all lost, and I think that is a common sort of thought that people have. It's worth noting that, for example, policy takes place at many different levels. There have been analyses time and time again that show that decisive commitments by cities around the world, for example, on climate change add up to more than the national level targets or the international level targets. And so engaging, for example, with local policy landscapes can be a really important way to make very concrete and decisive progress on these issues. And then finally, let's say, we are not just policy takers. In some sense, all of us in the computer science community can also be policy makers, in the sense that there are lots of ways in which we can engage with the public policy landscape to actually inform how that progresses. So for example, the technology policy panel that has already been mentioned from ACM, on the international level, for example, the OECD has an AI observatory and the Global Partnership on AI, which tries to inform AI and digitalization policymakers about how they can actually shape these technologies, with some of the initial reports being, for example, how can we shape these technologies in ways that are aligned with climate action, so that at the very least the sort of way we're developing AI technologies don't make the problem worse and ideally make the problem better. So there are lots of kinds of policy that we can engage in, and I think engaging is a really, really important thing to do.
Yeah, I agree with everything Priya said. I think as technologists, we always love to laugh when we watch these congressional hearings and we see these bumbling senators not know how email works. And we feel very smug when we watch this. And it is true, we do need policymakers in DC to understand how these technologies work so that we make regulation that is urgent and smart. But I also think that humility needs to come in our direction as well, because we also need to know how to shape policy, how to shape systems, how to understand the communities that we're claiming to serve. And so I think, again, going back to like why machine engineering feels so urgent, it's really taking it's an all hands on deck approach, and no one sector, no one team is going to fix this problem. And so we really have to recognize that we all have to kind of cross that bridge and learn each other's disciplines just as much as they need to learn ours.
Okay. Thank you both. And with that, we end the first half of the and if we can get 15 minutes on the good, and can we get Jeff's slides?
Excellent.
Jeff is going to give an a cappella.
Yes.
Your slides are here.
Excellent. Great. So I am your health panel. I am excited to be here. Thank you very much to the moderator, and I enjoyed your remarks as well. I'm going to be talking about the potential of AI for improving health around the world. I'm presenting the work of lots and lots of people at Google and many other institutions. Oops, sorry. Let's go back one. So I believe AI is really critical to improving the future of healthcare. I think medicine can be both more accurate, more equitable, more accessible, less expensive, and more humane with using AI to help clinicians, to help patients, to help people understand their health and make good choices than without. And if we apply this technology judiciously, we can enable healthcare systems to learn from the past in order to make better decisions for patients in the future. Like an aspirational goal would be all past healthcare decisions could improve future healthcare decisions. Now, there's lots of impediments to preventing that vision, but I think it's a good North Star to kind of keep in mind. I think as computer scientists and technologists, we need to help where we can, but also know that this is an interdisciplinary approach that we need to work closely with healthcare practitioners, with people to understand where technology makes the most sense to apply and where it can really help. This is not an environment where you want to sort of move quickly and sort of without caution. You actually want to go slowly, prove things out step by step, go slow, and test things. Okay, so a traditional view of healthcare is every so often you go to the doctor and they do some measurements and then they make some decisions and then you go away for a while and then you come back 6 months later or whatever. But if you think about what's happening in the technology space these days, there's all kinds of new information that is relevant to health that is coming and becoming more available in these varying levels of kind of frequency, levels of utility, and so on. So I'm going to talk through each of these. So first, let's look at the traditional information and see what we can do with just kind of the information that is in your electronic medical records. So in particular, given a patient's electronic medical record data, can we predict the future and therefore help clinicians deliver better care? And one of the things that's been happening in AI in general is we've been getting much better at sequential prediction tasks. Given some prefix of something, can you predict what comes next? This is driving a lot of the improvements in language translation, language modeling in general. And if you kind of squint at it just right, a medical record arranged in time looks a lot like language. If you see the first part of it, can you predict the rest or some abstract property of the rest? And so that was kind of what we set out to try to do. Could a machine learning system read and make sense of medical records when you lay them end to end in time order? And in a typical medical record, there's lots of kinds of information. There's like labs and medications and procedures and clinician notes and diagnoses and so on. And if you could make sense of this, you could help with a lot of clinically relevant tasks. In particular, will this patient be admitted to the hospital in the next few weeks? What's their likely medical expenditure? Are they likely to develop diabetes in the next 12 months? What are the likely diagnoses given a patient with these symptoms right now and this past medical history? What medication should I think about prescribing? And so one of the things we've been looking at is, can we actually go and use this approach with de-identified medical records to then be able to predict and accurately predict lots of clinically relevant medical tasks. And here's one example from this paper. Can we predict mortality risk for a patient given their sort of past history? And it turns out with a sort of deep learning-based machine learning model, we can actually improve and get the same accuracy 24 hours earlier than previous methods that are actually used in clinical practice. And so that means that clinicians can actually focus on patients that are at the most risk to really make sure they pay extra attention to those patients. In the space of imaging, the advances in computer vision have really made a huge difference. So general purpose computer vision now works. That means there's all kinds of really interesting applications in medical imaging. And there's a whole range of work in this space working on diabetic retinopathy or ophthalmology-related problems, mammograms, pathology-related things, radiology. I'm going to talk through a couple of them. These have the properties that there are both 2D and 3D kind of imaging problems, as well as ones where you get just a single image and ones where you get lots and lots of views. The diabetic retinopathy work is the one that is the most mature, so I'm going to kind of talk through how that actually gets deployed in practice. Next slide. And so this started with a paper that some of my colleagues published in 2016 in JAMA. It was actually recently selected as one of the top 10 articles of the decade by JAMA. Not top 10 AI-related articles, but top 10 articles. So the medical community is really paying attention to this. And in this paper, my colleagues showed that you could actually train a machine learning model to be as accurate as a US board-certified ophthalmologist at diagnosing diabetic retinopathy. In follow-on work, they actually changed how the data was labeled by getting retinal specialists who have more training. They're sort of the gold standard of care in this kind of ophthalmological problem. And so if you label the data with retinal specialists and use an adjudicated protocol to label the data where 3 retinal specialists kind of get together and debate the subtleties of gray spots, you can actually get a model that's now on par with retinal specialists, which is kind of fantastic because now you can have that gold standard of care and apply that around the world. And so one of the things we really want is to do more than just publish things. So we've been working to deploy this technology around in various places around the world with partners. We started in India, where we're now screening patients at 23 sites across 3 partners. We have deployments in Thailand. And this is really important because 400 million people are at risk worldwide and should really be screened every year. But there's a shortage of trained ophthalmologists around the world to actually do this screening. And if you catch diabetic retinopathy in time, it's very treatable. But if you don't, people suffer full or partial vision loss. Another area that's interesting is dermatology-related things, because the sensors, the camera itself on your phone, can actually be used to help assess dermatological conditions. There's about 2 billion people every year affected by some sort of skin condition, and billions of people come to Google products like Search and Lens. But until recently, the use case was really not very well supported. But with this approach, we actually now have a CE-marked dermatology assistive app that can be used to give people actually pretty good guidance for skin conditions that they might be experiencing. Sensors, I think, are another really interesting thing. If you think about the phone you probably have in your pocket and maybe the watch on your wrist, those are just, really kind of powerful sensor packages. If we could, yeah. So there's, lots of sensors you're aware of, and some you may not even be that aware of. And some of those can be really useful for collecting health-relevant information kind of continuously or things like that. So given a couple of examples, there we go. You can now use the camera to sort of assess people's heart rate and respiration rate. We can actually use sensors on people's watches to get pre-symptomatic detection of COVID in a study that was published in 2020. Behavioral data, I think, is really interesting and can really inform public health decision making. So I'll just give you one quick example of this, which is by aggregating interesting mobility data and doing it in a privacy-preserving way, we can give governments and other policymakers information about what their sort of COVID public health policies have done to people's mobility around their community. Are people still going out to restaurants? Are they going to parks? What has that done? And so this has been a really useful, it's used by tens of governments globally to really assess and help guide policy making in the COVID-19 response. And so I think that's one area that's pretty interesting. You can also get aggregated information about searches kind of at coarse-grained geographic areas to get insights into what kinds of communities are searching prominently or not so prominently for vaccination-related information. And that can help inform policymakers about do they need to sort of promote vaccination more and in what kind of forums. Oops, if we go back one. Finally, genomics, I think obviously the cost of genetic sequencing has been dropping tremendously over the last 2 decades, much better improvement than even Moore's Law. And so we've been working on how can we use machine learning to get the raw data from sequencers to be even more useful for genomic data analysis. And so deep variant is one thing we've been working on for a little while, which is how do we actually use machine learning-based approaches to call variants for genetic sequencing data that comes off raw sequencing machines. And this has got the best accuracy. If we go back, yeah. So I show this timeline for deep variant, which is sort of one sub-project within our genomic research project, just to show you kind of the long timelines at which you really need to be thinking about sustaining work and improving things over time, working with different partners, making sure that the work you're doing so far is useful, and that then finding additional applications and uses. And so as one example of the utility of this, using deep variant, which is able to more accurately call genetic information, actually increased the diagnostic yield by 14% in a cohort study involving prostate cancer and melanoma patients with actionable findings. So that means you now have more power in sort of studies of a particular size. And it's been adopted for large-scale sequencing projects all around the world, which is nice to see. But if you think about personalized medicine, really that's about, can we use genetic information to really understand someone's medical condition? And so this is a story of a Stanford University patient, this boy, who came in with a heart condition, and the doctors really didn't know what was going on. It could be a heart infection, in which case a transplant wouldn't make sense because the infection might still persist, and a transplant wouldn't make sense. Or it could be a really rare genetic condition that might actually where a transplant might make sense. And so using a collection of different partners, including Stanford, UC Santa Cruz, NVIDIA, and Google Technology, they were able to actually sequence and analyze the genome in just 5 hours and 2 minutes, which makes, and time doesn't make all the difference in all cases, but in this case, it actually was really important to assess this quickly. And so they were able to analyze this, find that the patient had a very rare genetic condition where a transplant would make sense, and they got him on a transplant list quickly. And so I think the use of machine learning to really improve people's healthcare is the opportunity that is in front of us. And it's going to be a long road to get there, but I think if we keep that North Star in mind of how to use AI to really augment the kind of human clinician and patient decision making so that everyone can make the best choices, the potential of AI to improve healthcare for everyone is really enormous. And real world impact is starting to accumulate in like these smaller scale studies or smaller scale deployments. And I think we're working towards an AI-enabled learning healthcare system where past decisions actually help inform future decisions and make better decisions. And that's a great vision I think we all in the computer science community and more broadly the healthcare community can all work towards. So thank you. There's a lot more information about some of this information at our health.google site. So.
Yeah, and I'm just going to throw in real quick that while this was obviously focused on Google, if you look up the other speakers who would have been here, you'll see some of the other things going on. I run a little project on the side, but Jeff, let me start with a question. We have a few questions. One is essentially relates back to the whole trust panel. Mm-hmm. And particularly with some of the, so the FDA has now actually recognized, I believe it was one of the retina things, not diabetic retinopathy, but for retinopathy, but other things. So we're starting to see the first devices coming through, but for a lot of things such as chest X-rays, things like that, we're getting good accuracies, but in the 90, 93 kind of AOCs, and so the problem is. How can we help, are there ways to help clinicians sort of, recognize outstanding cases that maybe are known from other things than the learning itself, and how do we integrate that in? Just, one example is there are certain conditions that can't affect people under a certain age. Mm-hmm. But if you're just looking at the picture, right, you can't know that. And you haven't seen any training examples of people that age because they can't have it. So, we've seen misdiagnoses that could have been used, where sort of knowledge-based AI coupled with these learning techniques look like they could have done a lot. And, obviously expert systems goes back to a long time ago at some of this, did it get it right? So do you see that as an emerging area that people might be interested in or looking at?
Yeah, I think obviously you need to be very careful when you're thinking about deploying these systems. It's best to first, prove this out in an offline manner where you're sort of assessing the accuracy of these systems, and then doing very careful, studies where you have perhaps this system plus a human clinician operating in parallel and really sort of trying to assess the accuracy of these systems in a way where you will do no worse than the human clinician decision-making process. So I think that's an important and careful phased rollout of all these things. I think, if you think about all the different kinds of information there, you're right. If you just look at the image, that's going to miss information that a human clinician would obviously be aware of. So I think the right answer is to integrate these kinds of information together into a single model so that you have all different sources of information. Someone's age, a lot more about, the actual image. And obviously, with any machine learning system, and it's particularly critical in healthcare environments, you really need to be making sure that the data you're training the system on is actually representative of the data you're going to be testing it on. So if you're like training on images of adult hearts, and then you expect the system to work well on a 10-year-old heart image or something, that's where any machine learning system is not necessarily going to perform very well. So you really need to be careful, know the limitations of machine learning, know that it's a complicated area, and be cautious in how you roll things out.
Okay, so thank you. Well, we do have some other questions. We're out of time, and they're very general, so I think we'll just leave it there. At the end of the panel, don't go away, because Jennifer is going to make some closing remarks, so let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Okay, so this has been just a fascinating day. I really want to thank all of our moderators and our panelists. It's been just fantastic. So I also want to thank all of you who are here and those who are with us virtually for joining us for this glimpse into the future of computing for the next 75 years. As I said when we were opening this, computing has really become, and it will increasingly be, the fabric of society, and we've heard that echoed again and again in the different panels during the day. It is so much more complex than it was at the 50th celebration. And the fact that it is becoming the fabric of society, if we do it without bringing in the humanist, the social, the ethical, the domain expertise in all these areas, it will be a very brittle fabric. It will be a fabric that has mistakes in it, unintentional bias in it, and it will be a fabric that is easily frayed because it will be vulnerable to attacks of various kinds. So as we've heard, it is our responsibility now, the responsibility of the computing community going forward, is to partner with all these other disciplines in academia, in the policy arena, with all of the professions out there, and to embrace our responsibility to work with them, and also to educate the people who are coming up so that they are multicultural. They have the culture of computer science, but they also have the culture of these other disciplines. And I just want to end by saying there was a word that came up repeatedly, which I was not expecting, and which really made me feel very hopeful, and that was humility. We must approach this with humility, not with the arrogance of a discipline that knows how to come in, model, simplify, and get an answer which wouldn't work for human beings. So I really, really want to thank you for going on this journey with us today. And I hope when we celebrate, I don't know, maybe we could celebrate the 85th, I don't know, not wait until the 100th. We can look back and say that we took some of that responsibility seriously, and we are becoming the partners of these other agents in the world. So So there will be a reception immediately following this. It will be in the Gold Ballroom, which is off to the right. And then the ACM Awards Gala will be tomorrow night, same place at the Palace, well, maybe not in this room, I don't know, but at the Palace Hotel, starting at 6 p.m. Thank you to everyone.